Two diametrically opposed worldviews playing out before world leaders gathered for the annual opening of the United Nations General Assembly in New York. First, they heard Donald Trump reject, quote, the ideology of globalism. Then it was French counterpart Emmanuel Macron. You heard him here on France 24, arguing that the world needs a new balance that defends universal values. UN Week, a chance to take stock of the challenges facing the planet and how we face them. Trump putting national sovereignty above all, Macron emphasizing common interest. With us to talk about it, Annick Cizel, senior lecturer in U.S. foreign policy and transatlantic relations at Paris's Sorbonne Nouvelle University. And welcome back from Washington, D.C., David Desroches, associate professor at National Defense University. Thanks for joining us. The France 24 debate on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24debate. Before we go to our panel, let's go to New York and the UN General Assembly. Jessica Le Mazurier is going to be joining us there shortly, our correspondent. Again, we're waiting to hear from Macron. Will be crossing over live to his press conference after the speech he made. Before we go back to Emmanuel Macron, let's talk about what Donald Trump had to say. And his speech clearly putting nations ahead of multilateral organizations.
The ICC claims near universal jurisdiction over the citizens of every country, violating all principles of justice, fairness, and due process. We will never surrender America's sovereignty to an unelected, unaccountable global bureaucracy. America is governed by Americans. We reject the ideology of globalism, and we embrace the doctrine of patriotism.
I think that we're seeing a crisis of the very foundations of today's world. We're losing our benchmarks and our modes of functioning. This is not a historical parenthesis. It's a reflection of our failures in the past.
Yeah, Emmanuel Macron saying only collective action can preserve the sovereignty of peoples. David Desroches, who convinced you?
Well, it's not a case of being convinced. I mean, look, the nations are situated differently. If I were Emmanuel Macron, I would focus on multilateralism because that's the only way France can achieve its goals. It's not as big a country as the United States, not as powerful a country as the United States. President Trump's views are different because he's situated differently. In his view, multilateralism is a restraint on things the United States has to do, in his telling, and he doesn't see the benefit to it. So it's not really a case of convincing or ideology. It's really a case of the different situation.
What struck you first listening to Donald Trump and then to Emmanuel Macron?
Well, I think Trump is speaking more to his domestic base than is Macron. Macron is clearly trying to convince other leaders in Europe and perhaps beyond, but primarily in Europe, of the validity of his position, of the importance of taking a multilateral approach here in the UN, but probably also through the European Union as well. Trump, on the other hand, is speaking, his voters view the United Nations and a lot of other multilateral organizations as a restraint upon American power, which they see as a force for good. And so basically what Trump is speaking to people in the United States, Macron is speaking to people mostly in Europe, but around the country, around the world.
Annick Cizel?
Well, I'm pretty sure that both presidents are addressing the rest of the world on this one. And definitely both of them playing with one keyword we've been hearing quite a lot in both speeches, which is sovereignty, and which definitely in Europe right now and in the United States right now do not cover the same meaning. With quite a twist of irony here, President Macron is using sovereignty in the sense the founding fathers of the United States, of the US Constitution, were using it. That is the sovereignty of the people. We've heard President Macron praising individual liberties and vouching to protect individual liberties, as in the First Amendment in the Bill of Rights of the US Constitution, trying to reduce inequalities so that everyone would have access to a form of representation around the world, which is very much the 18th century humanism. And he actually added somehow spontaneously the word to the written speech. This 18th century influence that France had of the Enlightenment had on the founding fathers of the US Constitution. It is this heritage which Emmanuel Macron is claiming now for sovereignty. It's the people who must choose and be respected by their governments. When President Trump is offering us the alternate vision of this in US history, more the end of the 19th century pre-World War I or interwar years version of this, I was referring earlier to the Republican Party refusing to adhere to the League of Nations in 1919. It's more that vision of the sovereignty of the nation above the sovereignty of the peoples, to the extent that there shall be no entangling alliances, as President George Washington would have said, but a couple of centuries back. And this is not the global world we live in anymore. I mean, today, the world today is not the world of George Washington anymore.
Jessica Le Mesurier is with us from UN headquarters in New York, our correspondent. Jessica, you've had front row seats now to playing out as the question facing the international community, which is it a collection of sovereign states, or do you use those multilateral approaches? Again, two very different speeches. Tell us about what the mood is like in New York.
Well, I think people were quite wowed by that passionate speech from Emmanuel Macron in the defense of multilateralism. He said that multilateralism doesn't have to negate the importance of sovereignty, but that countries must work together, that it is our duty to work together. And he underlined quite how dangerous nationalism and the rise of nationalism and populism across the world can be. He said that we all know what the consequences can be, saying that it could lead to global conflicts and even to genocide as in the past. So he had a stark warning, and he really got very riled up in this speech, very into it. He began quite highbrow, but then he really got down to giving details, answering directly to Donald Trump, really, listing the organisations that Donald Trump has pulled out with and showing his defence of those organisations. And he spoke in detail about climate change and the Paris Climate Accord, and said that despite the pullout of the United States, everything is being done by France and its partners to make sure that the fight against climate change continues. He also spoke specifically about UNRWA, the Organisation for Palestinian Refugees, saying that, this affects children. Cutting money for UNRWA means that children cannot go to school. So really, he gave an impassioned plea that I think was quite well received here.
At one point, he even said that he was rejecting trade deals with countries outside of the Paris Climate Change Pact.
Absolutely. So directly aimed at Trump yet again there, but maintaining his level-headedness. Really, he had a very diametrically opposed vision of the world compared to Donald Trump in his speech. And as I said, I think that it has been quite well received here, and some surprise perhaps quite how eloquent he was, and quite how strong his speech was, because it was expected that he might be a little more modest this year in the way that he spoke. But no, very strong there in that speech.
So the two of them answering each other, and yet the previous evening, Jessica, we had Trump and Macron sitting down together for a sideline talk.
Absolutely. You do see quite a contrast between Macron when he's face-to-face with Donald Trump and Macron when he's on a world stage giving a speech. It would seem that Macron in private and when he's face-to-face with Trump is continuing to use this kind of charm offensive, not challenging him directly, in the hope that that might help if he maintains a friendly personal relationship with Trump to convince him and give him some more sway when it comes to negotiating with him and convincing him indeed not to cut foreign aid any further, not to pull out of any more international organisations or deals, François.
Jessica Le Masurier reporting live there from United Nations headquarters in New York. We'll be crossing back to UN headquarters in New York when Emmanuel Macron speaks in a short while to journalists. He'll be speaking to them in a short bit. David Desroches, at one point in his speech, Macron said, "I don't believe we're all one people, but I believe in universal values," and this idea of that you can't be strong if it's the rule of the strongest. And he pointedly mentioned the Iran deal in particular on that point.
Yeah. Well, honestly, your previous guest mentioned the paradox of the warm relations between Trump and Macron. And honestly, I don't think that the ideals there are a point of disagreement. I think it's the implementation. Unfortunately, what Mr. Macron seems to miss, but which President Trump, I think, feels, and a lot of Americans feel as well, is that there is a strong current of American exceptionalism. There's this idea that only the United States can guarantee these rights, and it can only do if it's unfettered. So we look at things like the failure of the UN mission in Rwanda, the failure of the United Nations to prevent Srebrenica massacre. The president of the Bosnian entity pulled out of a UN-painted armored personnel carrier that was guarded by French army soldiers and executed by Serbs. All of those were eventually solved by unilateral American military action. So that's a realist point of view. It's not widely shared or even remembered in the rest of the world. And obviously it's not accepted widely within the United Nations, which is the home of multilateralism. But that's kind of that's the realist American interpretation. So there's not a difference on ideology. There's not a difference on goal. There's just a difference as to how best to achieve those goals. And I don't think President Trump really expected to make many converts in the United Nations. Again, I think he's speaking to his domestic audience.
Besides defending clean coal, as he put it, and a few passing references to the environment, Trump barely mentioned environmental issues in his speech. Emmanuel Macron talking again about the rejection of trade deals with countries that walk away from the Paris Agreement. Does it alarm you that it doesn't seem to be much of an issue, neither at the UN for Donald Trump, nor even in the campaign for the midterm elections, the environment?
Yeah, well, it is an issue in the United States, but honestly, the people who are animated by concerns of the environment are not Trump voters, and we're never going to be Trump voters. So, it's just a hostile pool to fish in. But, Macron and some of the analysis of Macron's remarks view this whole spectrum of multilateral issues and view Trump's rejection of them as part of an ideological opposition to multilateralism. But actually, the differences stem from different issues. So the climate accord is really an implementation issue. The Trump administration's view is, why should we kneecap our economy when India and China are going to continue to do what they're doing? They just don't see it as a practical thing. The UNRWA is over issues of implementation. These are all different issues in Trump's mind, I believe, and they're motivated by different factors. So if you portray it just as a rejection of multilateralism, I think you miss a level of analysis there.
Annick Cizel?
Well, their visions of multilateralism are definitely drastically different. I mean, when Emmanuel Macron is referring to climate change, he's thinking of what we call the global commons. And he's definitely thinking that some global issues cannot be undone at this stage and must therefore be pursued as with global thinking and with global dialogue. And he's pointed as well at one of the most immediate shortcomings of nationalism being on the rise across the planet, which is the gradual multipolarization of the world. The world is no longer bipolar as it used to be in the Cold War, but it was globalizing in a way which was avoiding the rise of other blocs or competitive blocs. What we have been seeing in the past few months is, I'll give one instance, President Obama had negotiated with China that the Chinese military might be participating in multilateral military exercises, maritime exercises, together with the US Navy. President Trump decided against it. And what did we see? A couple of weeks later, China was invited by Russia to join in Russia's military exercises. Russia and China do not necessarily share national interests that will make the two countries align on each other. Except that if rejection is the norm, if the United States chooses its allies and totally refuses dialogue with its, not to say enemies, but countries that are a little more difficult to deal with. We heard President Trump saying, we're going to reward our friends with foreign assistance, and only our friends. If dialogue is not broader than this, what this is pushing countries which are major powers. I mean, France may be a middle power, China is not, Russia is not militarily speaking. And what this is causing is accelerating the multipolarization, accelerating countries that did not share national interests to the point of getting together, but they are getting together. This is causing a country like Turkey to, at the same time, be a member of NATO and turning to Russia to get armament at the same time. This is allowing this and therefore changing the world order towards something more fragmented.
We're going to cross over to the UN and listen. Emmanuel Macron addressing the visiting press pack.
Thank you. Oui, Béatrice Adjage, RTL. Mr. President, Donald Trump et vous-même, on a le sentiment d'un dialogue de sourds, d'une opposition de plus en plus frontale. Alors, le combat est rude, vous décidez d'engager, mais est-ce qu'il n'est pas inégal?
Isn't it an unequal struggle?
De quel point de vue?
From what point of view? I talked a lot about inequality. What do you mean by an unequal? Unequal from what point of view? You denounce the rule of the strongest, and the US is the top economic power in the world. If I talked in the name of France earlier, I am trying to defend a vision based on values, on a political project which goes beyond the borders of our country, which is supported by the EU and by the United Nations. When we fight for the Paris Accord, we're fighting for an agreement that all the sovereign states have signed up to, and we have to support. Nobody, we're not isolating ourselves. We are moving forward. We're not moving forward fast enough. We have taken a number of initiatives. But when you have decided to fight, you can go ahead and do so immediately. As regards trade, there are international rules which are not totally satisfactory. But do we solve the differences by returning to protectionism and a trade war? I don't think so. We are engaging in dialogues, not only through France, but also the World Trade Organization, the EU. When I express my views in favor of cooperation, regional cooperation, and the defense of what we have all created within the UN, the UNRWA, UNESCO, I defend what we have done as a sovereign people. So you mustn't see the opposition between two countries. Today, France is very much attached to defending the UN organization, the principles of the United Nations organization, and the universalism, which has, in fact, was the very origin of the United Nations. So what has happened is not an opposition between two countries, but the fact that we do not have to support the unilateral decision of one country to withdraw. What is France's position regarding the membership of Saudi Arabia as an observer of the UOIF? What is France's position regarding the membership of Saudi Arabia as a member of the OIF? Have you already spoken to the president of the Rwanda, who is the president of the African Union? What did you discuss with him? What do you think of the liberation of former President Gbagbo? On the first point, we will be working with the Secretary General on expressing our views on this subject. A few weeks on, we will be talking about this in Yerevan. I will be meeting this afternoon President Kagame. We will be talking about the bilateral relationship between our country and economic development, and we'll also be talking about regional crises and the role of the African Union. And in this regard, France is strongly committed to supporting the greater involvement of the African Union in settling regional crises, and more particularly, we are committed to intensifying UN action, and I will be discussing that again this afternoon. As I said in my speech, I think we should organize operations in fighting terrorism based on partnership between the African Union, the United Nations, and decisions will be made by the end of the year. Better coordination between the African Union and the UN is very important, and we'll be discussing various sensitive issues affecting the continent, and we'll probably talk about Francophonie, French language and culture. President Kagame defends the candidature of his country for being Secretary General of Francophonie. Regarding the last question, it's not for me to give my views on domestic issues. International law should be respected at all times and everywhere, but in countries that have enjoyed a democratic transition, a reconciliation process should also be implemented. We always encourage whoever favors a transition that will lead to greater stability.
Je recommence. C'est bon là? Pardon, excusez-moi. Paul Larouture au quotidien, je veux vous demander pourquoi vous avez maltraité votre pupitre comme ça à la fin et que Donald Trump n'était pas là pour vous écouter, mais
your desk when you were speaking, when President Trump wasn't there.
Je présenterai toutes mes excuses.
I will apologize to the desk, to the podium, for having hit it with my hands. I hope I won't hit this one. No, I was very passionate because I believe very strongly in in my views. In this period, we are facing risks of cynicism or getting used to cynicism. If we're all getting used to the worst possible discourses and cynicism, I don't think we're up to the challenges facing the world today. We had a discussion yesterday with President Trump, which allowed us to observe some disagreements, but to move forward nevertheless. I would like to move forward with the US positively on various issues. First of all, on the Syrian issue, there is a change in the U.S. position in this regard, which I would like to pay tribute to. The U.S. is more committed to Syria, to the Syrian issue than it used to be. The United States agree with us on the importance of the humanitarian emergency in Idlib, and they share our determination to favor a political settlement and to have a real inclusive process and to accelerate the move towards elections and a new constitution. So I'm waiting for the U.S. views on this. So this is the method. We respect sovereignty of the people. We work with international cooperation to get quicker results. I would like to talk to the U.S. also about Iran. We have a methodological difference of views regarding the 2015 agreement. The United States, in President Trump's speech, they do want to get an agreement. He said that they've taken a strong position. They want to get guarantees regarding nuclear power, ballistic missiles, and regional borders. This is the line we defended a year ago. I would like us to build with different methods the solution that will bring peace to the region and find a sustainable solution on Iran. As regards trade, the EU we want to limit conflicts with the United States on trade. We had a dialogue at the beginning of the summer on that issue. So on a case-by-case basis, we are convincing each other that cooperation is a good approach. Choices have been made. I would like the United States to join us and to support the Paris Accord. I'm not very optimistic in the short term. On the contrary, we must accelerate. I regret the decision taken by the International Penal Court, the UNRWA and UNESCO, and I hope the US will come back to UNESCO. We will not give in regarding the strength of our messages, of our values. We want to work with the United States, which is a partner for settling regional crises and for security and getting results.
From India, I just had a question on multilateralism because that's a big focus of the Secretary General. When do you see Security Council reform expansion actually happening? And a second question, because it's the biggest thing currently in India and it's got to do with Rafale. Did the government of India
could you repeat the first question? Sorry.
Multilateralism?
Yes.
Multilateralism is what the Secretary General has mentioned is one of his key priorities.
Yeah.
So he says, I'm asking you, when do you think that Security Council reform expansion will actually happen? Okay. That's the first. And the second is about the biggest controversy currently in India about the Rafale deal. And did the government of India tell France or Dassault at any point that they had to accept Reliance as an India partner for the Rafale deal?
Look, for the second question, I will be very clear. It was a government-to-government discussion, and I just want to refer to what Prime Minister Modi very clearly said a few days ago. And I have any other comment to say. I was not in charge at that time, but I know that we have very clear rules, and this is a government-to-government discussion. And this contract is part of a broader framework, which is a military and defense relation between India and France. And this one is very important to me because this is a strategic relation and not just an industrial relation. So that's my point, and I just want to refer to what Prime Minister Modi said on this situation. As for multilateralism, if you listen to me carefully, I supported and clearly endorsed the process launched by the Secretary General. I'm not in charge of the timetable, and I'm not the one to lead it, but I will support it, and it is the Secretary General to explain and say in details when it will be feasible. But I do believe we have to broaden precisely our way to cooperate in the different fora of regulation. That's why I do support the fact that we have to reform the G7. That's what I expressed and explained during my speech, and we will make some proposals to the other members in order precisely to take into consideration this new reality.
Thank you so much.
Mr. President, congratulations on identifying inequality as the root cause of so much of the crisis in the world today. And I would like to ask how you would propose reducing this inequality. Can you comment upon Kofi Annan's call for a global New Deal? Since you say the current global order is disintegrating, perhaps a new and more progressive and egalitarian one is possible. Gordon Brown has also called for a global New Deal. And as a follow-up, since there are constant calls for funding for the SDGs and complaints that there isn't enough, would you consider the possibility of transferring some of the money invested in the military into global development, healthcare, education, since my country is quadrupling its investment in nuclear weapons? Thank you.
Look, first we will increase both development and defense. We will reach 0.55% national revenue in terms of development by the end of this mandate. And we will increase our military defense following the guidelines and my commitments during the campaign. And there is no transfer, but I would say a double commitment to increase both. Because I think we have to protect ourselves, for sure. We have to invest. We have to invest as well for the European protection and as well our participation in different operations, for instance, Sahel or Middle East. As for the idea of a global deal or global compact, I do support this idea. You know, in Europe, the Prime Minister of Sweden launched a very similar idea with Kofi Annan, precisely about such a global deal, which is to say we need now a sort of more comprehensive and consistent view of our economic development. And I do support that. And the way for me to address inequalities in this current environment is first, increase our investment on development, what we will do. Increase our investment on education, health, agriculture, and economic opportunities, because that's the key elements precisely to bridge the gap for a lot of societies. But third, to be consistent on a day-to-day basis with our own economic and financial model. And that's why I do believe now we have to reform in depth our global organization of trade in order to be more respectful with environment and social rules. Second, I do support this idea that we don't sign any trade deal with countries not compliant with Paris Agreement, because our trade deal have to take into consideration our own environmental challenges. And third, I think we have to take new social commitments, especially at the international level, on social rules and social standards. So I do support this idea.
Mr. President, about the Syrian refugee from MTV Lebanon, Alan Dargam. So we feel in Lebanon, or the government also feel that the international community is not given the impression that to help our government in the process of the Syrian refugee to go home safe. Instead, you're putting so much regulation on us. And on top of that, the UNRWA stopped funding to help the Palestinian refugees. So we have a sense that we're going to face more problems economically, politically, and also security. And instead of being rewarded, we're being punished because we were pioneer help in this crisis.
I mean, if somebody is always trying to help Lebanon, you have it in front of you. I think so. Please. And precisely because I'm extremely committed in helping Lebanon, your president and the prime minister, we organized these 3 conferences, and we pushed very hard to organize the 3 conferences in Brussels, Roma, and Paris to help on the different layers Lebanon in this crisis. But I've always been clear about the fact that if we want to help Lebanon, we need a sustainable solution. The pushback of refugees right now, as you have Idlib and the war in Syria, do you think one sec this is a sensible and sustainable idea? And look at what's happening at the frontier. How much of them are accepted by the Syrian regime? I mean, Mr. Grandi told me 50%. Some NGOs told me they accept everybody except the males. It's impossible to have a sustainable return of the refugees if we don't have a political solution to the crisis. That's why I do want to help Lebanon, Jordan, and Turkey in this crisis and this situation of refugees. But I think it would be a fake solution precisely to propose you an unsustainable option for these refugees, i.e. to force them to go back to Syria. We have very clear rules, clear international rules, and I want us to respect the HCR rules. They have to choose, and we have to respect dignity in such a move. That's why my view is definitely that we have first to fix a political crisis. And I want to work with, obviously, your president and your prime minister in such a work. And that's why our strategy today is to accelerate on the small group and Astana process in order to work with Mr. de Mistura in order, precisely in the coming weeks, to finalize the Constitutional Committee and go to elections, which, I mean, this is a precondition to any return.
Mr. President.
Il faut juste un peu de règle. On va alterner entre la presse francophone et anglophone. Simplement, je demande.
Oui, bonjour Monsieur le Président Elsa Conessa pour les Échos. Le président Trump
said in his speech that he was willing to sell more gas, coal and oil and soja. Is France willing to buy more American soja and liquid natural gas? I have been clear about the trade agreements. They must comply with the Paris Accord. The negotiations are underway, and they will tackle all these issues quite clearly. It's not France that needs particularly to buy liquid natural gas. We are attached to European and French sovereignty. It's at the heart of our energy policy or strategy, which I will be presenting in a few weeks' time. We're not a state that imports such products. As regards agriculture, I'll be very clear. I believe in European sovereignty, and I have to report to my citizens to guarantee the standards of food. Our citizens don't want the organisms. We are asking our producers to provide high-quality food, and our strategy in the food area is very clear. We will not be importing products that don't comply with European standards. I'm not in favor of that. In your speech, you said that the fight against inequality is one of your priorities, and you also want to invent a new universalism. France has refused to accept the refugee vessel Aquarius. Don't you think that a humanitarian gesture would have been a great thing today, in spite of the rules that you have set? Your question is legitimate. Welcoming the Aquarius vessel would not have been in line with our humanitarian policy. We will be accepting the largest number of refugees who are on the Aquarius ship. We have a European strategy. We see ourselves as mediators. There's a political crisis between Italy and the rest of Europe. Italy has decided no longer to comply with international law, notably military maritime law, which lays down that when a vessel has passengers who are in a humanitarian crisis, they must be able to disembark at the nearest port. So Italy is in violation of this rule. French ports are not the closest ports to that vessel. Malta, at one point, had accepted to accept the vessel. Malta is the closest alternative port, but it had a guarantee that there would be European solidarity. And as we did this summer, France asked several European countries, including Germany, Spain, Portugal, and a few others, to take their share, and we are one of the two countries who has accepted the largest number of refugees since the beginning of this summer political crisis. So this new humanism does not mean accepting the law of the jungle, and I am aware of the tensions that exist. And if I start saying France will be accepting all the vessels that are leaving Africa, I don't believe in this solution. It's not sustainable, nor is it sustainable politically in France. And people who are worried about the strength of migration, the French voters will say they have a president who isn't defending their interests. So humanism is a requirement to respect human dignity. And I am aware of the fact that I am sometimes seen as not giving in to easy humanitarian sentiment. I don't want to support xenophobic extremism, and which will not support would not solve the situation. And I want to work with the countries of origin, with the transit countries to fight against traffickers. We often forget, many of your comments and reports forget the traffickers, the human traffickers. We never talk about the traffickers. And how did they manage to get in this situation? Today, thousands of people are making a lot of money because they are complicit with terrorists. Somebody from Cameroon, Senegal is on a vessel off the coast of Tunisia. They didn't choose to be there. So we must better protect our frontiers in a more humane way, and we will do so with a European approach. We will play our share. We will give asylum to people who are entitled to it, and we will send back to their countries of origin those citizens who have no right to asylum. So I believe in humanism, but I don't believe in the provocation or the easy, facile human sentiment.
Mr. President, please. A few minutes ago,
il faudrait que quelqu'un s'occupe de donner le micro à une personne avec une alternance entre la presse francophone et anglophone. Voilà. Alors, c'est à madame, et puis après, il y aura quelqu'un de la presse francophone.
Thank you. Merci. A few minutes ago, you said you don't want to sign trade deals, quote, with countries not compliant with the Paris Agreement. There is one country that has pulled out of the Paris Agreement. Does that mean you will not sign any trade agreements with the United States of America?
Ça veut dire qu'il n'y a pas de grand accord qui est possible s'il n'est pas conforme aux accords de Paris et à nos propres objectifs. Et je répondais à l'instant à votre confrère français en ce sens. Il peut y avoir des accords qui sont trouvés, par exemple, sur des sujets industriels.
On industrial questions, I discussed this at length with President Trump yesterday. On industrial questions, vehicles, on medical equipment. We're talking about a lot of things at the moment. We must find solutions to equalize tariffs. It's not a major trade treaty. We want to pacify the situation and go. If it's neutral in terms of climate impact, I'm in favor of it. But the time of large trade organizations which are negative in terms of climate change are no longer acceptable to me.
Bonjour, Monsieur le Président. Bertrand Galichet,
Bertrand Galichet of France Inter. You mentioned earlier the question of a reform of the governance of the world. France will be chairing the G7 very soon. What will be what freedom of action will you have with a partner in the G7 such as Donald Trump? Do you have the means of changing things, and will you be making precise, concrete proposals next year? Yes, there are issues on which we are moving forward, are continuing to move forward, and with very great ambitions with the United. The fight against terrorism.
You're watching live coverage from Paris, from New York, from the United Nations, where Emmanuel Macron, the French president, is briefing the press after giving his speech at the rostrum of the United Nations General Assembly, its annual opening UN week in New York, where we've been witnessing two very contrasting visions of the world. By the way, Donald Trump will be giving his talk to the press a little bit later on at 5 p.m. local time, 11 p.m. here in Paris. He'll be speaking to journalists as well. We're talking in the company of Annick Cizel of Paris Sorbonne Nouvelle University and of David Desroches of National Defense University in Washington. The press conference is an exercise on a foreign trip like this one, where you get questions from both the French press, the international press in English and in French. It was interesting to hear at one point Macron talking about how we have to increase spending for both defense and development.
which is definitely wishful thinking, I would think. This is going to be a sad conclusion, I'm afraid, but I just can't see. He's been so pragmatic on a lot of the propositions he's made today, and this one, especially without the United States on a global scale, on a fiscal scale for France, it's going to be extremely tough. But on a global scale, without the United States contributing up to what it used to contribute to UN agencies, for instance, it's definitely mission impossible. So wait and see. To what extent will President Macron get China, India, other major economic powers to pitch in and actually make it feasible? Well, this may be the next round of negotiations.
David Desroches, your thoughts?
Well, yeah, I mean, look, the U.S. contribution to various UN agencies was set at the formation of the UN when the United States was in a dominant position, and we pay a dominant proportion of all UN. So it's been the aim to kind of reform that, and perhaps Trump is pushing the ball along a little further. But some of these other things are not unprecedented. The United States has been in and out of UNESCO over the years. We've had an ambiguous relation with human rights organizations of the UN, in large part because, you know, countries such as Cuba seem to have a disproportionate influence, and it's just hard to justify that to American voters and taxpayers. So I think that this is not a revolutionary approach by Donald Trump, and I do think that, you know, when you look at Macron's remarks, he's doing a very good job of trying to seek global leadership, and more power to him on these issues. But I don't think he's going to meet with a whole lot of success, and particularly if any of his policies have a bite in the French economy, I think he'll retreat from them rather quickly.
And just very briefly, he talked about in that bilateral sit-down he had on Monday evening with Trump that he sensed a change in the U.S. position when it came to Syria, and perhaps he hoped some convergence when it came to Iran. Your thoughts?
Well, look, Syria, the United States, and France have pretty much been in lockstep, and you know, there's a lot of other areas, you know, in the Sahel where the United States and France are working together in close partnership. You know, and in NATO we're close partners. We have much more that we agree on than we disagree on. With Iran, I think that the primary issue there is Iran's overseas activities, its sponsorship of militias, firing missiles into Iraq. Possibly assassinating leaders of the Iraqi security forces who've been trained by the United States. There have been, I think, 4 senior leaders who've died in the counterterrorism forces of Iraq in the last month. So there's a little bit more spade work to be done. But, you know, if Macron can come up with a deal that is truly acceptable to others, that can actually be accepted by the United States as a treaty, which the Iran deal was not, then again, more power to him. And I think that, you know, Trump, the cliche in the United States is we say that his enemies him literally but not seriously. I think that, you know, Macron takes him seriously, and would be a mistake to take him literally. So I think there is some sunlight here. Some
light there. David Desroches, I want to thank you so much for joining us from Washington. I want to thank Annick Cizet. By the way, we'll be hearing from Iran's president coming up with Laura Sellier. Stay with us here on France 24.